My next guest is Mark Chartier. Everyday Mark mentors students who must overcome serious challenges, but he knows they can persevere because he did. Growing up with Tourette syndrome, Mark had poor grades and demonstrated significant behaviors, but thanks to positive relationships with his educators, he was able to defy expectations and succeed in school. As an adult, he sustained a brain injury and developed a significant stutter that made life exasperating. Despite these challenges, he went on to earn two master's degrees and made an impact as a special education teacher. He is a walking success story. Despite challenging disabilities, he built a prosperous career in education. Now he wants to see others triumph over their individual obstacles. By sharing his journey through motivational speaking and his poetry, he educates others about diversity, advocates for individuals with disabilities, and motivates people to overcome serious challenges. Mark lives in Pueblo, Colorado. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me on.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out, and you said you'd like to share one story from childhood and one as a teacher.
Yes. I think the first story I would like to share, just to kind of get the audience acquainted with my story a little bit, is I grew up with Tourette syndrome, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 18 years old.
Mhm.
And so I went through all of public school without any supports or any services that I probably should have been provided had my diagnosis been known earlier. However, I thanks to positive relationships with teachers, I was still able to overcome and succeed and persevere through quite a lot.
Mhm.
Um, and so when people ask me about Tourette's, one one of the first things they ask me is when did I first realize or notice that I had Tourette's?
Mhm.
And as far as my memory goes, the first tick that I had was when I was about 7 years old in
Okay.
the summer of 1983. So I'm dating myself a little. But I was living in Long Island, New York, with my parents, and my mom and dad had just decided to split up. And as a result, my mom had temporary custody of me, even though my dad had permanent and sole custody of me legally.
Mhm.
There was a lot of controversy and arguing and fighting between my mother and father at the time. And so I was with my mother for, gosh, probably several weeks, maybe a month. Um, and my mother suffered from schizophrenia.
Mhm.
She had a very tragic young life as well, probably much more tragic than mine, mine is not a walk in, even though mine was not a walk in the park. Hers was very traumatic, I'm sure, for her. So she was in the midst of what I call a schizophrenic binge.
Okay.
So because my father was her whole life and his
Mhm.
family, she didn't have a family of her own
Mhm.
outside of my dad and me and my brother and my dad's family. And so my brother was at camp, and I remember every day for, gosh, probably about a week, my mom would have me hop in the back seat of the car, and she would just take me and drive all around New York, New York City, New York upstate, sometimes even to Montreal, where my grandparents lived.
Mhm.
And and we would go into restaurants and we would order drinks and food. And then 2 minutes later, she'd be grabbing me by the arm and saying, "We got to go. We're out of here." And
Hmm.
I would be, and of course, I was 7 years old at the time, and I'm why are we leaving? She's like, "Your father is watching us." And it's very apparent to me in hindsight that the schizophrenia was really pervading her perspective at that time.
Mhm.
And so she even took me to the hospital several times and said we're not well, that we're sick. And again, I'm 7 years old and I'm questioning, I'm like, what's wrong with us? And again, we would go
Wow.
to the emergency room, and then within 20 minutes of being seen, she'd be taking me and running out the door with me. And
Mhm.
so that was a very traumatic time. And as a result of that, I remember having my first tick. I had the spiral notebook, and I
Okay.
took the spirals of the notebook, and I strummed it along the lips of my mouth. And
Okay.
I did that so hard and so fast until my lips blistered and bled.
Mhm.
And that to me is the first Tourette symptom that I remember having.
Mhm.
And the way I explain it is there was so much mass chaos going on around me that as a child I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't process it.
Mhm.
And so that was my way of processing it. And that is as far back as I can remember my first tick that I had.
Mhm. 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 And so you have a trench story as well from being a teacher. Was that related to having Tourette's, or how did you come out of the trenches in a teacher situation?
Well, I actually have a poem in my book
Okay.
that I wanted to share about it, but I will preface it a little bit.
Okay.
Um, so after that episode with my mother, my father re- regained custody of me and my brother, and so I grew up with my dad from age 7 on. And
Mm-hmm.
while my dad, I truly believe in my heart that he did the best he could. He was abusive at times, quite often physically
Mm-hmm.
and quite often verbally. And so I remember when I was about 15 years old, I was he had dropped me off at the grocery store that I was working at, and I had just spent about $30 on comic books, which back then in 1991,
Yeah.
1990 was a lot. And so um, he had told me that I needed to be home in 15 minutes. Well, the walk home alone was probably 15 minutes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, I was going to be late, and I was typically late. So I went home, I was late, and he kicked the tar out of me and destroyed my comic books and all this and that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day I went to school and I had bruises along my neck and my cheeks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine, an older friend of mine who was a senior in high school, asked me, "Who effed you up?"
Yeah.
And of course, like at that time, I didn't know what to say because my mother was out of the picture. My mother was out of my life.
Yeah.
And even though my father might not have been the best dad in the world, I knew that he loved me and that he was the best dad he could be. So as a result, one of my brother's friends found out about it and made a DHS call.
Mm.
And shortly after, I was questioned by DHS at my high school, and I lied. I lied. I
Yeah.
froze in the moment. I knew what foster homes, what the reputation that foster homes had, and I lied. And they even followed up with a house visit to my house, and my dad never opened the door. And shortly after that, we moved to Colorado. And
Okay.
so I've never talked about it with my dad, but years later, my first year of teaching, I had a similar experience with a student,
Mm-hmm.
and I will say no more and just read the poem if that's okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, great, great. So this is a poem from my book, Fingerprints, and the title of the poem is called Bystander.
Okay.
You stagger into my classroom, papers falling from your books, and I know you haven't taken your medicine. You look like your mom, the sweatpants, the rush chair, the knock knock, broken aspirin, bags under your eyes. You look like her, except you're tiny. Fourth grade doesn't play by the rules when your bio dad left the game early. It doesn't explain life in future tense verbs or number facts or pinky swears. It doesn't open a hand and ask, why? Even the psychiatric drugs you take for ADHD, depression, and anxiety don't explain why your mother leaves you in charge of your own medication. In the morning, you say a crisp goodbye that's returned with muffling from under her covers, through the door with the hole you made with a broomstick. Her costing breaths are the answers when you're done making your own lunch of 2 pieces of bread and a can of Coke. Mom, the door doesn't talk back when you want to say bye-bye. Take a spray of her vanilla perfume. Check that you know the wrong answers to the questions that keep you blue-eyed, and make sure that you don't mention the unmentionable. Your stepfather came home from Iraq 2 weeks ago, and you've come to my classroom with a new bruise every other day this week. Black ran blue on your shin, red times 2 on your arms, saying you got them during testing, saying you were tough, tiny, tough. You told me I could adopt kids, but not you. But maybe your daddy and I could be friends. And I didn't want to believe the faces on your bruises, the scratch marks around your elbows. I wanted to think you were just as clumsy as you said, that a second grader did do it during morning recess, or that it was Halloween and you were dressed up as a girl who'd been abused, as I picked up the receiver and made a phone call that was tougher than you.
Wow. Yeah, that's super powerful. Just, I mean, a lot of us educators, experience, having to make those DHS calls and having a student like that in our class, but putting it to words and you recognizing, that that was a similar situation to what you had been through. Yeah.
Yes, and so like as a kid, I was on one side of the DHS call,
Hmm.
and then as an adult, that especially with that being my first year in teaching,
Okay.
and this was a kid that I had a very strong connection with. She was like me in so many ways. Um, so being on that other side of that DHS call was really tough for me. It was something I really grappled with. But
Hmm.
in the end, I decided that all I can do is report it and pray that everything works out best for the child.
Hmm.
Um, and since then, I've had to make calls, and it's never easy, but it's something that I've come to terms with. And it's just part of the territory of looking out for kids and doing what's best for kids.
Yeah, yeah, but definitely the first is always the hardest, and especially when you've been on the child side as well. Let's talk about just kind of what got you into being a special education teacher and how your experience as a student led to you wanting to go into the field.
Okay, great. Um, so I really struggled as a student in public school. I On my website I say I was a teacher's worst nightmare,
Uh-huh.
and I really was in so many facets and ways. I got into many fist fights. I committed vandalism in high school. Um, I had poor grades. I was very talkative, very interruptive. I was just really a handful.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was the Tourette's, and then part of that was my home environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I was 15, I moved from Long Island, New York to Colorado Springs. And even though between age 7 and 15, I had nervous tics that kind of waxed and waned,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they would come and then for a couple months they'd go. Um, I know some of my tics involve barking, and some of my friends and my brother usually actually used to call me Mark Bark Ark,
Mm-hmm.
as kind of teasing. And so though my tics when I lived in New York kind of came and went. But when
Mm-hmm.
I moved to Colorado Springs, they just really blew up.
Okay.
And at the time, I attributed this to moving away from all my friends in New York, because I never wanted to leave New York and all my friends in New York.
Mm-hmm.
However, in hindsight, you know, 15 years old, kids' bodies changes, things change developmentally, new atmosphere. I was in a new high school. Who knows what it was? But
Yeah.
I know that very early on, at the high school that I went to in Colorado Springs, I got into a fight with a kid
Mm-hmm.
who was kind of picking on me, because here I am, I speak different, I act different, I look different. Um, and I was in this fight, and the athletic director came and grabbed me by the side of my face.
Mm-hmm.
Now that means something totally different back then, because I had hair. So, so, so it was quite painful. So as soon as the athletic director grabbed me, I let go of the kid,
Mm-hmm.
and he started to pull me by the side of my face and my hair. And I actually shrugged him off and said some colorful words to him that were not
Mm-hmm.
very nice or kind. And he went back and he grabbed me right here. And again, I shrugged him off,
Mm-hmm.
and he cocked back his arm like he was going to hit me. And then I went into the office crying in tears. And the assistant principal came and said that he had several witnesses saying that I took a swing at a teacher. Now, of course, at the time, that wasn't my perception. That wasn't my
Mm-hmm.
lens that I saw. However, as of course, in hindsight, I can definitely see how the flinging of my arm could be perceived as a swing. So at that time, I was the assistant principal attempted to expel me,
Mm-hmm.
and my dad, for all his good points, he fought for me and stood up for me, and got the expulsion hearing dropped.
Okay.
um, and after that, I was still very angry. I was still very upset. I was very angry at the school. And me and this guy that I palled around with, we ended up doing about $1,000 worth of vandalism over the next 4 months.
Wow.
And we sprayed down the gymnasium with a fire extinguisher. We broke into the pool and took the gym teacher's office contents and her sneakers and threw them all in the pool. We stole concessions. We did all kinds of things. We destroyed offices, and then we got caught about 4 months into this stuff. And of course, they separated us, played good cop, bad cop, and got us to confess to
Mm-hmm.
everything that we had done. So as a result, I believe that the principal, the same assistant principal that had previously tried to expel me, I believe that he suspected that I had a disability by that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
he did not try to expel me, although he probably should have and had good reason
Mm-hmm.
to. So what he did was he ended up he ended up assigning me to detention for all my free time for the rest of the school year.
Mm.
And in that detention center, where I spent several hours a day, there was a lady named Mrs. Susie Tracy,
Okay.
uh, who I formed a beautiful connection with. Here I was, a kid that was angry, that grew up without a mom. And here was this lady who was, probably in her 50s, mid 50s or so. And she just demonstrated a lot of kindness, a lot of interest in my success,
Mm-hmm.
and inspired me through our relationship to turn my behavior around.
Mm.
And so next year, even though I didn't have to go to detention, guess where I ended up going anyways?
You went there to hang out
I
with
went to
her.
detention to hang out with Mrs. Tracy. And so it really went a long way as far as turning my behavior around. And I had other teachers along the way that really developed uh, inspiring relationships with me. So fast forward to college, my 6th year in college, because it took me 6 years to get my bachelor's.
Mhm.
But I sustained a toxic brain injury, which I have a poem that I'd like to share a little later, if that's okay.
Mhm.
But I had sustained a toxic brain injury, which had increased the severity of my Tourette's, and I
Mhm.
also caused me to develop a significant stutter. But yet I was able to make it through my bachelor's degree.
Mhm.
And I thought, what next? Like, I
Mhm.
wasn't ready to go back to go out into the big bad world because my stuttering was still very significant. And so I thought, what can I do to make a difference in the world? And I thought about all the people that made a profound impact on my life. And they were educators, from Mrs. Tracy to my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Belser, to my French teacher, Mrs. Weed,
Mhm.
to my college creative writing professor, David Keplinger. All these people had inspired me in so many different ways that I decided I wanted to go into special education and help
Mhm.
kids that had similar struggles as me.
Mhm.
So that was what led me to grad school. And I'm not saying it was easy and there were
Mhm.
no challenges. There certainly were throughout my bachelor's degree and my master's degrees, both of them. But I was able to get in. I was able to earn my master's in special ed, and shortly after I began teaching, I realized that I fell madly in love with the profession, and
Mhm.
I realized that I was in a unique position where, because my kids are intelligent. My
Mhm.
kids, like, whether they're on an IEP or not, my kids are intelligent. They're in their own ways, right? Like, they can pick up and ascertain that, hey, Mr. C, which is what I go by in
Uh-huh.
school, Mr. C was a little bit different. There was something different about him.
Yeah.
And so I was able to identify and connect with my students in a unique way. And so rather than being ruled by my disabilities, I
Mhm.
rule my disabilities and I use them as a conduit and as a bridge to my students.
Wow, wow. Yeah, I really like that. Rather than being ruled, you rule disability. So how has that helped you be a great special ed teacher? And what do you think is the most rewarding part of being working with the kids that you work with?
Well, the most rewarding part of working with kids is the relationships that we
Yeah.
build, and getting to know them and inspiring them and coaching. Because yes, I teach them reading, I teach them writing, I teach them math, I teach behavior, but overall my end all goal and objective is to teach them how to be um, good members of society, and productive individuals, and people with good character, and people who embrace diversity. Just as I teach them every day, I'm like, hey, we're all different, right? Some of us have brown hair, some of us have blonde hair, some of
Hmm.
us have no hair, and that's
Yeah.
okay, because I find that we learn that I've in my life I've learned the most from people that are different than me. And so
Hmm.
I always preach diversity to my students. And I've just been so blessed and fortunate to have had the most amazingly talented and gifted students. Um, and I'll share one story with you, and
Hmm.
this just comes to mind. I was working with this student one time. His name was Moses, and I have nicknames for all my students. And my nickname for him was Mostis. And I was
Okay.
giving him an assessment, a special education assessment, and I needed his birthday for the
Hmm.
assessment.
Hmm.
But I said to him, I said, "Hey, Moses, what's your birthday?" He goes, "April 22nd." I said,
Uh-huh.
"What year?" He said, "Every year." And so I just love how my kids think outside the box, right?
Yeah.
Like my kids, I like to call different kinds of smart.
Yeah.
There are different kinds of intelligence. For example, another special person in my life is one of my best friends who has Down syndrome, and
Mhm.
his name is Stony Pool, and
Mhm.
and he might not be able to, read uh, a 400-page novel,
Mhm.
but one of the things that Stony is really good at is he knows every WWE wrestler known to man. He
Yeah.
can match every NFL team to their city,
Yeah.
and he always remembers my birthday. Even,
Uh-huh.
even now, my birthday's in November 29th. He's been planning my birthday for 4 months already.
Yeah.
He's been planning my birthday celebration. So there's different kinds of smart and just seeing my kids think outside the box. And I do want to add one more thing. Um, in addition to teaching special education, I also do poetry workshops at my
Mhm.
schools. And these poetry workshops are enrichment activities that I offer after school.
Okay.
And they're open to any kid, whether they're gen ed or special ed or any kid. And over the years, as I've done this, I have had the good fortune of having, or the luck of having some of my students participate in these poetry workshops.
Mhm.
And they always end up culminating in a poetry reading.
Mhm.
And to see the students that have reading disabilities sit there and create a poem, and then get in front of an audience of sometimes 50, 60 people and
Mhm.
read their work that they created. I always say that teaching is a love of my life, but
Mhm.
poetry was the first love of my life. And
Mhm.
so when I'm able to mesh the two, that to me is just heavenly. And so just seeing my some of my special education students over the years, um, express themselves and develop a love and affinity for poetry, and then seeing them persevere and triumph by reading their work in front of a large audience just amazes me
Mhm.
and leaves me in awe. So
Well, you can go ahead and share that poem that you wanted to share. You said that it's helped you a lot, especially after you dealt with a traumatic brain injury. You started writing a lot of poetry.
yes, yes. So originally I was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury and a
Mhm.
toxic brain injury.
Okay.
And this one goes back to, it starts out kind of where I was at when I was
Okay.
struggling a couple years ago,
Okay.
and then it delves back into the event of the toxic brain injury.
Okay.
It's called The Fifth Wall. I was sitting in your patient room asking about what we can do to help the Tourette's, the OCD, the anxiety, my toxic brain injury, my sleep that tallies me to a sleep, walk, and makes me feel for the walls of my bedroom, and recently for my 38 snub nose in the drawer missing its drawer. I'm staring at your socks, asterisking your ankles, then your shoes that seem a bit Walmartish for a neurologist as busy as you. Next, I'm making irrespective faces with your patient table to my left, wondering why you never have me sit on it. Why do these medications never work? Because my body can't tolerate the side effects, or I'm nerved and atrophic to smiles and air and have trouble getting along with trouble. You had that experience with the oven cleaner a while back. The next question is, how do I remember that? I remember an angry while that hurt from many tears ago when I was flooded by fumes of Easy Off, sticking my head inside the oven after the restaurant manager snapped, "We don't have any masks." The vapor upsiding my face as I made the mistake of breathing, scrubbing up to my elbows. The ventilation system is broken. I jokered around, laughing my lungs, my mood pervious to a siren high. I remember driving home that night, my eyes doping to sleep, in the parking lot of my college dorm with my car still running. I came to about 4 hours later, my mind fogged as I clutched inside and slept for 14 more hours, exclamatory in bed as if a tourniquet was circling my neck, while the toxic brain injury rasped. My speech blistered and senses oofed. When I woke, that's when I drove to your office, an hour of cycling through traffic with the tempest of undoable ramparting my mind, ticking my neck so violently it popped. And that was when your receptionist told me I was 17 minutes late, that I would have to reschedule. His next available is 4 months out. But I had this accident at work. I don't feel right, rattling like a machine gun. You're 17 minutes late. You'll have to reschedule. 17, the age when I found out I had Tourette's, when I stopped noticing normal and toughened myself like never, sitting in your waiting room, the tears non-negotiating my throat as I tried to talk some strength into myself, praying you get word of my accident and call me back to sit on your patient table. Now, with revision of the heart, I'm in your office again, and you're explaining to me how I've overcome my Tourette's and OCD with my intelligence and creativity, that you worry about dousing that part of me with too much medication, alluding to somatization, my seek to suffer. Your Tourette's has made you the teacher you are. And I think back to that 5th grade boy, Brandon, who I taught to read in my special education classroom, who also had Tourette's, when we were 5 fingers deep in a text, and he chippered up to me, Mr. C, is heaven for real? I don't know, Brandon. I haven't been there yet, but I'd like to believe it is. Well, when you get there, could you maybe come back down and tap me on the shoulder and let me know? Yes. Yes, I can.
Wow. It comes full circle in that from your experience and then to the classroom with a boy living through the experience similar as yours. Wow. I really like it's such a treat to have these poems on the podcast.
Thank you.
So, what is the message that you give when you have these motivational speeches during your professional speaking? What is the general message?
So my message is the power of positive relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and never giving up, and also always persevering,
Mm-hmm.
um because a relationship is so powerful. I was talking to someone just yesterday at my school about it.
Mm-hmm.
If I go to the mall and I see 2 kids messing around that I don't know, and I discipline them or correct them or call them out, it means nothing to them because
Yeah.
I don't have a relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
But with my students that I have a relationship with, if I correct them or have to discipline them or take some kind of corrective action, it means something to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that relationship is so important. I needed those relationships as a kid with disabilities, and my kids today need those relationships. Those same need those same relationships. And my kids might not be the highest achievers on state assessments, but I can guarantee that my students work to their optimal performance and work as hard as possible because of that relationship I have with them. So when I give speeches at conferences and school districts and universities, my overarching message is how a relationship, whether it's positive, how a positive relationship can help inspire students to overcome disabilities
Mm-hmm.
and abuse and mental illness or any other kind of challenge in their life. And also how I also talk about how challenging relationships, like the relationship with my mother, um,
Mm-hmm.
and even my father, how those relationships were difficult to overcome, but thanks to the positive, I was able to overcome the negative ones in my life.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so when I speak, I share anecdotes from my childhood, from teaching. I share poems that, as you can see, involve the shared successes of not only my students but also me. And a lot of those things are very similar because, as we've discussed, a lot of the things that my students have gone through are things that I've gone through as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And not always as a kid. Sometimes there are things that my kids have gone through as kids that I've dealt recently with as an adult with a disability.
Yeah.
So the two are very go hand in hand, and I think that relationships are so important and such a lost art in education that there are many great educators that do take the time to build relationships, but also I know that with the challenges of COVID-19 and low resources and high student numbers, it's not always possible for teachers and not just teachers but educators in general to have that time and that rapport and that that the ability to form those meaningful relationships. But my speech is predicated on the importance of the must of
Mm-hmm.
building those relationships rather than the maybe of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the point, the must. Like we can't just let it go, right? So I'm interested in knowing a little bit how your work as a special education teacher intertwines with your work as a writer, and when you started publishing books, because you have a book, Fingerprints, that's out, and you're working on your second book called Crosshairs.
Yes.
So how did the publishing get started, and how do you find the time for all of it?
Yeah. Well, for one, I'm a single guy.
Hmm.
I've never been married and I have no kids, so my students are my babies.
Uh-huh.
So I do want to insert that in there. But also like I started writing. I started writing seriously as an undergrad and
Hmm.
in college. I was an English major, and I used to write these cheesy rhyme scheme poems that had a lot of great sentiments to them, but they weren't very respected among
Uh-huh.
my peers. And my creative writing professor, David Keplinger, suggested that I try writing free verse poetry. He said that the rhyme schemes constrict my language and my ability to write a poem because I'm so focused on making that
Hmm.
on making the rhymes work. And
Yeah.
so I started writing free verse poetry, and right around then was when I started stuttering. And so writing became my outlet. Writing became my catharsis of expressing my emotions, my
Hmm.
desires, my experiences, everything I wanted to accomplish. And I just kept at it. And over the next several years, I kept working on it, even though I wasn't still taking English classes. Um, and then when I got a job as a special education teacher, my shift kind of focused. So I used to write a lot about relationships, which there are relationship poems in my book. But then I started writing more about my teaching experiences. And again, that's where the meshing of the two loves of my life
Okay.
come into play because I was able to take teaching and poetry and make it into one.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's really where I feel I'm at my best at, not just as a teacher but also as a writer. And so it took a long time. I actually sent out the manuscript for Fingerprints to several publishers over a span of, gosh, probably about 5 or 6 years. And I kept retooling it and retooling it after each rejection. And actually, the people that ended up publishing it, I sent it to them probably about 3 or 4 times prior, and it got declined every time. And then on New Year's Eve of 2017, I said, okay, I'm going to send it to them one more time. and if they don't publish it, I'm going to self-publish it. Well, 4 months later, I was delighted to hear that they had accepted it and agreed to publish it. And so that last poem that I read, The Fifth Wall, that's a poem from my current manuscript called Crosshairs, which I've been sending out as well over the last, I've probably been sending it out for about 6 to 7, 8 months now. And a lot of those poems have been picked up in literary journals individually. So they're available in anthologies, literary journals, and I actually won a poetry contest a few months ago for a poem that's in my working manuscript. And so yeah, I just, it's just a love of my, it's just an extreme passion of mine. And I feel like I continue to grow as a writer, but it's not just something I do because I like, it's something I do because I need to do it. It's kind of like breathing for me. Like when I'm struggling with making sense of something in my life, I turn to the paper, I turn to writing, I turn to my notebook. And poetry to me has always been kind of saying the unsayable and kind of putting it out there and making sense of what I can't always make sense of orally. So I write it, and I just think on a different level when I write. As your viewers can probably tell, I still have remnants of a stutter. It's not as bad as it was 15, 20 years ago, but it's still there a little bit. And so, but when I write, I think on a different level. And so I just love writing, and I love writing about my teaching experiences and also my life experiences. And that's what this new manuscript is about, probably even more so than fingerprints.
So the manuscript that you're looking to get published these days, when it does come out, people can read a lot about the stories of your day-to-day life as a teacher. But then the one that you've had published already, Fingerprints, is that more kind of your life as a student growing up and kind of maybe as a college student and overcoming the traumatic brain injury, those types of things?
So when I talk about fingerprints spans about 11 years of writing.
Okay.
And there's 4 sections, and the first section is mostly about my teaching experiences. And then the second section is titled Things That You Wouldn't Tell Your Parents. And that's basically a lot of poems about my mother. There's one about my dad and one about my best friend and his dad, who had a very complex relationship.
Okay.
But almost all the other poems in that section are about my mother.
Okay.
And then the third section is more about relationships, but not relationships in the traditional sense, just like the beauty of a flawed relationship.
Okay.
Because no relationship is perfect. And sometimes we find, or hopefully we find beauty in those flawed relationships, regardless of the problems or issues that exist in them. Mm-hmm. And then the last section is more about my kind of more about my physical ailments, my Tourette's. There's a couple of poems about Tourette's. There is a poem about my experience with a doctor where he first told me I had a traumatic brain injury. And I actually, at that time, I didn't quite believe him because it sounded kind of sketchy at the time. And then there's a poem, the last poem, I won't say anything about, but it's I've been told it's the best poem in the book.
Okay. I'll let people buy the book.
yes. And it's a poem about a very traumatic event in my life, and I'll say no more.
Okay. Yeah. You don't want to give the whole book away.
I don't want to give the whole book away. No.
Okay.
And Crosshairs is very similar, only my teaching it contains my teaching experiences over the last 3 or 4 years, which
Hmm.
obviously have included COVID.
Yeah.
I did go from being in a brick and mortar school to teaching remotely,
Hmm.
and that happened in the blink of an eye, and that was tough for me. That was tough for me to have that separation from kids that I'd worked with for several years, and then all of a sudden to be behind a computer screen and working with new kids and not having that closure of being able to, really see those kids again and say goodbye to them.
Yeah.
um so so the current manuscript involves a lot of that, and there are also some social justice pieces in there as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
There's a poem about the George Floyd incident, uh,
Hmm.
and kind of my response to that, and just kind of a just kind of my take on it. Yeah.
Okay.
So so yeah.
It'll be
So
interesting to read when that comes out. But yeah, I can link maybe some places where that is. You said published in a few literary journals. I can put some links to maybe some of those poems in the show notes. Well, we could talk about that after a recording. I did want to you to highlight any professional speaking you have coming up, or maybe places that you're available to speak. I know we're both in Colorado, but do you travel some for speaking, and what type of venues or conferences are you most interested in speaking at?
yes, yes. So I believe that my speeches are appropriate for anyone or any organization that is open to hearing an inspiring message about overcoming adversity and increasing acceptance of diversity, and also the power of relationship building.
Hmm.
Whether it's kids with disabilities or people of different genders or ethnicities or anything like that. So I spoke recently. I did a keynote in Anchorage, Alaska, at the
Hmm.
Alaskan statewide special education conference, and that was a wonderful experience. I spoke for an hour and a half and shared several poems from my book and my upcoming book. Um, and that was a collection of educators, and so I have spoken to many educators in the past, whether it's at conferences in Colorado Springs or Denver. I did a keynote one time in Denver at the Colorado Convention Center
Hmm.
at the Equity and Excellence conference um, the for a collection of state special education administrators and Title I administrators. And I've also spoken at the Courage to Risk, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but that's at the Broadmoor in Colorado
Okay.
Springs. And I've spoken there several times. And so I'm really open to any kind of event. Uh,
Hmm.
I believe that I have a unique story.
Yeah.
I have a lot of poignant anecdotes, but I also have some witty anecdotes as well.
Hmm.
So there's some tears, there's some laughter, and hopefully overall there's a lot of change uh,
Hmm.
in perspective and lens and attitude in acceptance of diversity and relationship building. I don't currently have any um, events coming up,
Hmm.
except a local poetry reading in Pueblo, where I'll be reading a collection, or sorry, I'll be reading poems from my books at that event. And yeah, just trying to get the word out there. The most important thing for me is to get my message out there to people to help the next generation of teachers,
Hmm.
learners, administrators, school professionals, school executives, and so that way we can spread the message and do what's best for kids in the long run. Number one.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and like you said, that's your story is special and poignant and something that people need to hear. So I definitely hope those listening to this episode will want to reach out. And you can provide us with your contact information in a minute. But I wanted to ask, out of everything we've talked about on the episode, your
Mhm.
experiences growing up, your work as a teacher, your poems, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Um, well, there's two things that come to mind right off the top of my head.
Hmm.
One is one is pretty much the mantra to my book, which
Hmm.
is there's three lines in my book that go, "You scar your way, I'll scar mine. Recovery is its own fingerprint." And
Hmm.
the interpretation that I hope people take away from that, and the premise for the book is that we all have injuries. We all have sustained injuries and afflictions, whether they're emotional, whether they're physical, whether they're spiritual. And just like every injury and affliction is unique, so is the healing that's necessary in overcoming and persevering over those injuries. And
Hmm.
so that's one thing that I'd like to share with the listeners is that um, that's kind of like what my book is basically about. How
Hmm.
every recovery is unique. And then the next thing that I would like to share is something that I share in my classroom every day, and it is always believe that you can make a difference, but never let your differences keep you from what you believe.
Hmm.
And I teach that to my kids every day, and when I break it down for them, I break it down in terms of you, in terms of embracing their differences and never letting them keep them from reaching their goals or their dreams, and also being accepting of other people's differences and diversity. And
Hmm.
so those are things that I really stand high on. Both things that really mean a lot to me as far as my so the first one, my philosophy when it comes to poetry, and the second one when it comes to my philosophy of teaching.
Hmm. Hmm. Where can people connect with you and find you online?
So I have a website. It's www.teacherwithtourettes.com. And that is my website that I use for my speaking business. And I have videos on there of me speaking. I have more information about my speaking and my presentations. I have a blog. People can subscribe to my page for email updates. Um, and then there's also my email at the bottom of the website, and a link to purchase my book as well. And
Great,
so
great.
so if anyone wants to, say hello, ask a question, if anyone wants to see about having me speak for them, that would be the best place for them to go.
Great, great. I'll make sure to include those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was really a pleasure hearing your story, hearing your poems, and just getting to know you and your goal and how life is as an educator for you and how you help your students.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. Thank you for having me on.